Welcome to the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle. My guest today is the journalist and author James Bloodworth. He's the author of Hired and The Myth of Meritocracy. In our discussion, we talked about the nature of left-wing politics, whether it has been subsumed by identity politics at the expense of class. And we also got onto his new work about toxic masculinity and incel culture. It was a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So James, a lot of people will know of you from your undercover work at Amazon and Uber and taking on low-paid work in order to sort of immerse yourself in that world. It does remind me very much of George Orwell, Down and Out in Paris and London, or his essays, The Spike, where he deliberately gets drunk so he ends up in jail to see what it's like, or he makes himself homeless to see what it's like. Was that any way your inspiration for that?
Yeah, so George Orwell, Jack London as well, these people were a massive inspiration. I mean, before I did the book, they were kind of a couple of the journalists who inspired me to want to be a journalist in university and when I was growing up. And those like Jack London's People of the Abyss and Road to Wigan Pier and Down and Out, they were kind of, they were massive inspirations for my book Hired and going undercover and writing about the side of society people don't really see so much, or when they do, it's, they just see the kind of homeless person on the street or something.
I mean, it's such a powerful idea, isn't it? Like, I mean, Road to Wigan Pier, that first half of Road to Wigan Pier, when he's in the community, he's right there. There's always this lingering feeling that he could pull himself out at any point, of course. But it's still such a sort of astonishing way to do it. What was the reaction? Firstly, what did you find? What were your findings from working in these jobs?
So, I mean, I set out originally just to look at the low-wage economy, spend 6 months. I'm from a working-class background, and it was a case of kind of going back 10 years later after graduating, and now I had some of the skills to actually document what went on. And I ended up working in an Amazon warehouse. That wasn't deliberate. It was simply I was looking for jobs, and that was one of the first openings I saw. It was very easy to get a job there. And I was really quite shocked by what was going on in the Amazon warehouse, like the conditions there. Yeah. I mean, I'd been a consumer of Amazon, but I'd never been inside one of its warehouses until I wrote the book.
Is this, I mean, your experience of Amazon, I mean, you mentioned things such as people urinating in bottles because they feared taking a break. But how common do you think this is? I mean, I think when I used to work in a call centre, and if you had to go to the toilet, you had to put a special code in, and sometimes people would monitor you and they'd follow you in if you were there too long. And this seems like quite a standard thing now, doesn't it? Yeah,
I mean, what's happened is, because, say, market leaders, if you like Amazon, have been doing things like this, then Amazon becomes the kind of models for other business people, some of them anyway, to emulate. Yeah. So, same with Uber and the gig economy. So, I worked in a factory years ago. When I was younger, I used to be a postman. I did all kinds of jobs like that, and like working class jobs essentially. And there was never any issue of going to the toilet. There was never any issue over taking days off sick. And what I saw at Amazon, where you were punished for taking days off sick, punished for potentially for going to the bathroom, this to me was entirely new. I hadn't seen that before. And I think it's got worse, as you say. I think it's spread since Amazon and these companies have been seen as kind of the market leaders. Those practices have spread because people look to emulate the most successful industries.
And why is that? Is that the influence of America? I understand that they have very few holidays generally in the culture of American employment life. Is that just the sense of, is that just the inevitable corollary of a capitalistic enterprise, that you mistreat those at the lowest end?
I wouldn't say it's inevitable, because I think there are lots of firms who do treat their workers quite well. And I think one of the issues is the decline of trade unions in the workplace. Right. That's a really obvious issue, because even in the Amazon warehouse, you had laws which were being broken, which existed on paper. So when I was at Amazon, half the time I was there, I was paid less than the minimum wage. And we have a minimum wage law. The problem is not the law, it's the enforcement of it.
Right.
And you have an understaffed and underfunded HMRC. But more importantly, I think you have no organic mechanism within the factory to enforce those rules, which would be a trade union typically.
Yeah, and so I think that's absolutely right. The trade unions are things which have just sort of fallen by the wayside. Is there any great appetite to restore the primacy of trade unions in this country, do you think?
I think for younger people, in particular, Generation Z and many millennials, they've grown up in an environment where unions aren't really a thing anymore, where unions don't exist. So I mean, I lived with a roommate of mine recently, a young American Gen Z guy, and he's very, very left-wing, but he didn't really have any idea almost what a trade union was.
Yeah.
Which is, to me, was quite striking. I think that's the problem, first of all. But I do think I think it's very hard for unions to get into some of these workplaces. So Amazon, GMB reps get chased out of the car park when they try to give leaflets over there. And the leaflets are it's not calling for strikes, it's just saying, these are your rights at work, join a union.
It's very strange. I mean, when I was at the call centre, I remember saying to one of the employees, is there a union here? And she laughed and said, we don't do that here. And I thought, well, shouldn't that be investigated or talked about at least? It just feels like it's not on the table.
Yeah, but then you do have some companies like Hermes, for example, the courier delivery firm. They've actually do have an agreement with the GMB and negotiated with them, and it's not destroyed their business or anything. They have actually been able to negotiate certain rights for their workers, and I think it's been a very positive development. So it's this idea that unions just create chaos invariably in the workplace. Yeah, I just think is wrong.
Now, I've had a number of arguments with people on the right, particularly, who are of the view that anyone who works hard can achieve and become rich. And my view has always been that there are certain, whereas I would not like to suggest that personal responsibility and hard work don't matter, because I think they're key, the fact is that if you come from a certain background, the odds are stacked against you. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of luck as well. And the doors that open through luck tend to come about if you are well connected and rich, and that's just the way it is. So do you think, am I right, is meritocracy a bit of a myth?
Yeah, I think meritocracy is definitely a myth. I also think there's the other side of that is, would meritocracy be actually desirable in the first place? Because, I mean, to some extent, I think it's desirable. Like, we do want people, if you want to do something and you apply yourself, you should be able to do that. But I think the problem with meritocracy as an ideology is it tends to say that, wherever you are in society, you deserve to be there. So let's say we had a perfectly meritocratic society. Mm-hmm. Would that justify, treating homeless people very badly or something? Right. Not having less compassion for them because, they deserve that because they're lazy or whatever. I mean, I don't think so.
But if we see meritocracy as simply the notion of equality of opportunity for all, mm-hmm. that, to me, that doesn't feel ideological to me. That feels just sensible.
I mean, equality of opportunity, yeah. I mean, I agree with it, and I think most people would agree with that. I think where the problem stems from with that, with just that, is that unequal outcomes kind of don't give you equality of opportunity. So if you have these vast differences between rich and poor, you tend not to have equality of opportunity because, for example, the rich can buy themselves into different schools, can pay their way through for different standards of healthcare, different universities, different communities where there's far less crime. So I mean, I do think equality of opportunity is important, very important. But at the same time, I think you also have to look at outcomes a bit as well. Not to say everyone must be equal in terms of how much they're paid, but you do have to look at the gap between rich and poor, the opportunities some people are getting and some people aren't, because that's influenced by money.
So the problem I have with the sort of the equity argument and the idea of looking at equality of outcome is it often seems to me impossible to quantify, and it often comes down to the notion of group identity, race, gender, sexual orientation, and that these are the things that determine whether you will be successful or whether you don't. It seems very reductive to me because there are all sorts of, factors that come into play in terms of how well you end up doing in life. But class and money, it seems to me, is much more tangible. This is something that you can see has an effect and is measurable, and is also surely the thing that would be most easy to resolve. Or is that naive?
Yeah, I think class has the biggest impact on where someone ends up in life, regardless of all other factors. I think there's lots of evidence for that as well. It doesn't mean that you disregard the other factors, but I think class is, like socio-economic background is so fundamental to where someone ends up in life. I think there are more interests at play in why we don't tackle that. So I mean, I think we have, with identity politics, for example, liberal identity politics, we have in society lots of people from different ethnicities, from both genders, from different sexualities, who have done well, and it's also in their interest not to change the class system. So whereas I don't think you have very many working class people, genuinely working class people, in the media, in public, in big roles in society. So that narrative kind of falls by the wayside a bit.
But why is that? Why is it the case? For instance, when the BBC implement quotas based on race, they say we'll have internships for non-whites only. They'll do things relating to women rather than men. But what they never do is implement a quota relating to class. If 7% of the country are privately educated, and if they were to say, well, 7% of our workforce can be privately educated, but no more, right? I would assume that actually by implementing that, you would resolve any other disparities as well, because ethnic minority people tend to come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. These things would just resolve, but it feels like that isn't even on the table.
No, I completely agree. The thing is, I mean, one of the reasons in America I liked Bernie Sanders was because he made that exact argument that one of the best things you can do for American blacks is to reduce the gap between rich and poor and improve socioeconomic outcomes for the working class. I think that's completely.
So why is it you think the focus has shifted to identity, group identity specifically?
I think in some ways because it's easier to quantify, if you like. So if say an institution says, oh, we must have a certain percentage of people who aren't white, it's very easy to kind of work out who that is and sort through that. Same with gender, not quite so much with sexuality, but with class, it's much more fraught, the debate over it. So there's much more of an argument over, oh, is that person working class because their parents work, or if you earn lots of money but your parents grew up in a council house, does that make you working class? If you culturally you like football and pop music, does that make you more working class? And there is, I think it's easy to work out. I think you look at the economic situation of the person and their family. I think it's the
that would be much
money.
easier, right? If our class was determined by how much money we had.
Yeah, I mean, that is fundamentally money, assets. I think parental wealth is a factor.
Okay.
If you spent all of your parents' money, but you were sitting on $1 million inheritance down the line, I think it'd be difficult to say you're working class. But at the same time, I think I feel like the issue is dodged. People become lazy and don't bother looking at that, and because it's easier to just focus on the other things. It doesn't help solve the problem though, because at the moment you have a situation where you can have a very wealthy, say, Indian graduate or something, or Chinese graduate. Those two groups which do very well typically in our society on average, who would get into one of those roles ahead of a white working class boy.
And that is something that strikes me, and I know this sounds anecdotal, I suppose, but I've seen again and again when you have these kind of tokenistic quotas put into place, you end up with a lot of rich ethnic minority people who would be fine without that leg up, and it's actually working class ethnic minority people. They don't get any advantage out of this. So it feels to me like it doesn't actually do what it sets out to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do think ethnic minority, say, people, job candidates, for example, do experience discrimination in different parts of the system, say in job interviews. So there's been studies done where people with certain names, say Mohammed or something, they are less likely to get a job typically based on just their name when they have the same qualifications. I think issues like that matter, but the problem I think we have at the moment is we do focus on that. We are trying to address that, whereas class tends to not come into focus at all. Well, occasionally it does, but even then it tends to be superficial things around class.
But isn't that because of the rise of this intersectional form of identity politics? I mean, you have people like Robin DiAngelo, who says explicitly that if you say what you said earlier in our discussion, that class is the most closely connected to opportunity, that is a form of white supremacy. That's what she says.
I mean, that's ridiculous. But yeah, I think it becomes a kind of self-perpetuating ideology where you have these groups. So DiAngelo would be a good example where they are. It's self-interest on their part. I mean, they don't really want to see the structure of society changed so it's more equal economically. And they promote this kind of idea that everything would be fine if you just had a boardroom full of, 50% men, 50% women, 5% trans people, in this country 12% non-whites, and that would solve the problems of equality, even if the boardroom was paid 100 times as much as the people in the factory floor.
Do you think that's what it is, though? Do you think that, I mean, she comes from a working class background, but she is earning, 12 grand an hour to go in and berate people for being white. So it is, I can see why it's in her interests to maintain that. But when I hear her talk and when I read what she has to say, it feels like she believes it. It feels like she believes that every single human interaction is underpinned by white supremacy, everything, and that we therefore need to completely rig the system in order to fix that. I think she's sincere.
I'm sure she does, but I think it's also in her self-interest to believe that now. That is her kind of grift, that is her thing. So she's kind of probably rationalised even the ridiculous parts of it, that it has to be true because it's in my interest to believe it's true. I mean, we all do that. We all kind of emotionally rationalise things which are in our interest at different times. I would say that's part of it.
Well, this brings us on to a conversation more broadly about the left, because my feeling has always been that the left has been so sort of invaded by the identitarian movement to an extent that I don't think it's really left-wing anymore. I mean, it would be one thing if you were focusing on race, gender, and sex, because, you know, racism does exist, homophobia does exist, sexism does exist, and you need to guard against it. But if you implement policies that relate specifically to those categories at the expense of class and at the expense of the idea of social mobility or the class struggle or whatever you want to call it, then how can you authentically call yourself on the left? Isn't that just at the heart of what being left-wing means? Yeah,
I mean, I think there's various different lefts. I think that's the thing, and it's each one kind of vies for control of the establishment of of whichever party, whether it's the Democrat Party or the Labour Party. I think the Democratic Party in America has gone down that route a lot more than the Labour Party here. I think partly that's due to the influence that still exists of trade unions in the Labour Party here, for example. So I mean, while on the one hand, yes, you do get the identity politics stuff with Labour here, there is still, I think, a social democratic agenda of some sort. Certainly with Keir Starmer, for example, and I think even Jeremy Corbyn, who I didn't like, there is still policies on, we need to have a higher minimum wage, we need to get trade unions into these workplaces. I think there is still like a residual, if you like, emphasis on that stuff.
I think residual is the word, though.
The activist base, I think, is less interested in that stuff. That's why it might not be forever. Yeah. But I think the people who are in the Labour Party in politics, have an influence on the party. I think there is still an attachment there to things like reducing the gap between rich and poor. I even think Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who are seen as, traitors to Labour, I think they were very interested in that as well. They did a lot in terms of paying more in benefits, incapacity benefit, things like that, and raising up the floor of pensioners and child poverty, even though they're kind of decried as like right wingers by these very identitarian young people on the left now. Yeah,
although it's interesting because New Labour felt like a right wing project to a degree. I mean, Tony Blair never described himself as left wing. I think he would reject that label. Mm-hmm. And those things that you describe feel, you could argue that the Conservative Party similarly vies for some of those things. So it just feels like there isn't really an authentically left wing party now. I suppose Labour almost became that through Corbyn, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, but I feel like Corbyn was more interested in the foreign policy stuff and some of the identity stuff.
He was, yeah.
He personally is obsessed with foreign policy, whereas I do think there is more kind of bread and butter social democratic stuff going on in the Labour Party now with some of the work they're doing with think tanks and policy stuff. Yeah. So I do think, the activists we see on social media who are just screaming and just outraged about these ridiculous things, I think that doesn't bode well for the future necessarily, but I think there are still lots of people in the Labour Party who are just doing the good, important but boring stuff.
But all of those sort of the loudest voices within the identitarian movement, they often have double-barreled names. They often went to private school. It feels like a very bourgeois movement to me, and I don't think we can escape that. I don't think, even the ones who proclaim to still have a fealty to the class struggle, such as Laurie Penny, went to Brighton College, went to the poshest college of all, incredibly privileged. So why does this correlation exist? Why, in other words, has the left? You were talking about many different types of left. Why is the left that is predominating now a middle-class left?
I think it's partly the decline of trade unions again. It goes back to that because that used to be a kind of funnel through which people would then often enter Labour politics. So they'd work on the shop floor, they'd achieve a prominent role in the union, then they'd get into Labour politics, things like that. There's been a decline in working class jobs in society anyway, traditional working class jobs. There's been a fall in social mobility, so people generally are not getting into jobs like politics from a working class background. And I think there's been, professionalization of jobs across the board. So David Goodhart, I think, has talked a lot about this. So you need all of these credentials just to do a job now. And in politics, you see there's been a decline in people who haven't got university degrees, master's degrees.
Parliament used to be, there used to be people from all walks of life in there. It feels like everyone's got a PPE now from Oxford.
Yeah, there was a period during the 20th century where it started to, because it was for the privileged Parliament, and then the 20th century you saw this kind of a more meritocratic movement where you did see more working class people coming into the Commons, but then that's kind of fallen back again, I think, and you've seen. It's quite complex. You've also got disenchantment generally with politics and institutions, which means working class people don't even want to bother going into that in the first place. But I think that's a big part of it. And it's just dominated by these voices who are very good at self-promotion, who are quite articulate often because they've been to these expensive schools and universities. And it becomes this, what Irving Howe once called stylized marginality. So it's about self-promotion, it's about kind of this grift and promoting yourself as a victim, and you're kind of this perpetual victim, but you're also a really prominent voice in these mass movements and often make a big income from that online.
I mean, that's very interesting as well, isn't it? The way in which the more sort of, I suppose, upper middle class commentators who do promote the idea that they are part of a victim class or want to identify into a victim class. I mean, this is happening a lot with, apparently at the moment, a recent survey said that up to 40% of young Americans identified as LGBTQ, which would suggest, I mean, just statistically, most of those will be straight.
Yeah.
So why are straight people identifying into an oppressed class? What's that about?
I'd say it's a fashionable label for some people. It's they have privilege, say socioeconomic privilege, and they need to find a way to skirt around that. So they will apply one of these labels to themselves. I mean, I don't think that's always the case. Obviously, some people are gay, trans, whatever. Yes, like say a gay person or someone who's black or Asian, they will experience life. They have a different lived experience to me. But I think automatically assuming that somebody's privileged just based on surface characteristics or like skin color or gender, I think it's quite crass, quite reductive. I think you don't know someone's life history. You don't know someone's life story. You don't know what kind of struggles they've been through. And particularly with class, those things are often not visible on the surface.
We've seen a lot.
I mean, those people get left behind then if that's not taken into consideration.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the discourse of white privilege, and it's, you know, I understand the concept and I understand what activists are saying, which is that if you are white in a white majority country, you're not going to experience prejudice on the basis of your skin color. And that's true. I mean, it does happen, but it rarely happens. So I understand that point. But there is evidence to suggest that the phrase in of itself has made things worse for white working class people, because it implies that there's nothing to fix here. There is no issue here. That poor people white people on food banks, they're fine because they've still got their privilege. Mm-hmm. You know, you've got people like Mama Bergdorf saying you can still be homeless and have white privilege, right? This kind of thing, guaranteed to create resentment, guaranteed to almost keep people down. So it is, and yet to make the point that I've just made is to open myself up to accusations of racism or whatever, wanting to promote a white supremacist status quo, which isn't true.
Yeah.
What do you make about this discourse?
I mean, I find it very divisive, which makes it then harder to actually address the socioeconomic challenges. So if you have movements of the left which are railing against white men, why would you alienate that constituency of working class people? Why would you not kind of want to bring people of all ethnicities together from, say, a working class socioeconomic background? Because you need to do that to actually change the system. You can't just... This is why I feel like it is almost in the interest of capitalism to actually divide people up like this. To say that, you know, you can't... If you're black, you cannot relate to someone who's white. If you're a woman, you cannot possibly understand... Or if you're a man, you cannot possibly understand what the experience is like to be a woman. I think we all have lots of things more in common than we don't. Even people from very different backgrounds. And I think the job of politics is to emphasize the universal, to emphasize what we share in common, so that then you can come together and actually change the system and get justice.
And that was the bedrock of all sorts of civil rights movements, and even Stonewall in its original form was about trying to find what we have in common, saying sort of gay people aren't these alien things, they're just like you. Whereas of course now Stonewall has flipped the other way and says, no, we're completely different, we're not talking to anyone. So that strikes me as a real problem, because all traditionally left-wing movements have understood that this is the way forward. Mark Liller wrote that book on the Once and Future Liberal and talked about how when left-wing movements, particularly in politics, really tie themselves into this identitarian knot, it never translates to success at the ballot box.
No, I mean it can't, because it's about success at the ballot box is about building coalitions, and that flies in the face of this like commissar-like policing of people's differences. So I think the internet's made this far worse, because you have people who have no authority in real life who seem to get off on policing the discourse online. So they will cancel people who step outside of that or say something wrong, and it just makes things even more creates even more division, which flies in the face of actually bringing about real change. It's like a game to those people.
So I would say, like, I'm really interested in what you said about how there being multiple forms of left wing. And to the extent that I think it's become so confusing to people. So if I talk about left-wing politics to people, they will assume I mean putting pronouns in your bio, flying a rainbow flag on Twitter, and being against free speech, for instance. Those would be, but that's not what, to me, left-wing means at all. So where do you how do you identify? Where do you put yourself now?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, that reminded me of something. I remember Christopher Hitchens said that when he was at university, the demand was like cops off campus, and now it's like cops on campus.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So that was quite amusing. I would still place myself on the left. I mean, I don't really identify with groups. I just think my main interest really is I still see that class and economics define where someone ends up in life and have the biggest influence on life generally and politics. So for me, class is the most important thing. So that, to me, I'm on the left. If everyone else thinks differently on the left, I still would say I'm on the left, because I think that's traditionally what the left is interested itself in.
Right, but then isn't there an argument for saying that, rather than say there are multiple forms of left wing and accept that, say actually no, there aren't. The identitarian movement isn't a left-wing movement, because the body of work of left-wing writing and literature over the decades is very much firmly grounded within class and money, and we can't get away from that. This identitarian thing strikes me as quite a relatively new phenomenon, and for me it feels more right-wing because it's obsessed more with middle-class concerns. So isn't there a case for just saying you're not left-wing?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you insofar as it is, I think, a middle-class thing. It's very compatible with capitalism. It doesn't really challenge the status quo. But I think it's slightly fruitless to get into, you're really left wing, you're not, because it's, at the end of the day, it's not a religious movement. You don't have this text where it's like, this is the one true. I mean, there used to be the debates about Marxism and this isn't real Marxism. It's like, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because it's like there is no one true word of the left or one true word of the right. So it's kind of like what the majority of the left thinks at the time, that is the left. I would just say I have a different interpretation of what's good for society.
I wonder if it might be best just to dispel with left and right altogether. I mean, because, if ever I get into a discussion about whether I'm left wing or right wing, I don't subscribe to an ideology. I don't let someone else make my rules up for me. Some of my views are traditionally left wing, some are probably traditionally right wing. And I don't care about that. And so maybe we just get rid of them altogether. Because it's tribalistic, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is. So it is becoming harder to kind of pin down those things. So if somebody asks me, are you on the left or right? I'll say left, but they'll often make assumptions then. And think I think things that I don't think. So think I have a problem with free speech, or even so, I think that I'll somehow think that the problem in Europe now is NATO or something, because there are lots of people on the left who unfortunately do say things like that. So I mean, it is becoming harder to kind of define, but at the same time, I do think that the labels still have some use, because I do think there are, so Bernie Sanders, for example, those left-wing politicians who do kind of focus still on traditional issues, and it does have some value, but it's more complicated than just left is. For me, like left is good, right is bad, or something. That's just, or left thinks this, right thinks this, because it is quite fluid at the moment, it seems.
Hugely. I mean, at the time of the 2016 election, I was contacted by, I'd done a number of satirical videos relating to Trump. And so people in America had contacted me saying that they had been Sanders supporters. When he dropped out, they voted for Trump, right? So and people can't get their heads around this, that actually, this is why I often feel that the division is redundant now, particularly because Labour is clearly no longer the party of the working class. I mean, that's absolutely clear from the voting record, isn't it? Or am I wrong about that?
I do think there is. So I don't want to do the thing where people redefine the working class to suit what's their favoured electorate. So I mean, one of the things that the Corbynistas did after the 2019 election was they tried to say that the real working class is like PhD students. Really? Out of work PhD students, and I mean there was this movement because fewer traditional working class people were voting Labour. There was a swing towards the Conservatives, so there were people in the Labour movement, and John Cruddas has written about this very eloquently. There were people in the Labour movement who said, well, actually, the real working class today is the people who vote for Labour. By definition, they're working class, and it's just like defining working class by what your ideological beliefs are rather than by your socio-economic background.
Yeah.
I do think that Labour does still have a quite big working class constituency. I don't think the red wall will stay blue come the next election. I think so much happening at the moment with the economics of Britain, for example. I think with inflation, with cost of living crisis. I mean, I do think that left-wing activists are wildly out of touch with the concerns of the man and woman in the street in those communities. But at the same time, I think people do tend still to vote with their wallets when they're squeezed this much. I think that will make a big difference come the election.
I generally agree, but I do think the impact of the culture war is underestimated insofar as Boris Johnson coming out and clearly expressing what a man is and what a woman is has far more of an impact than people realise, I think. The fact that Keir Starmer and his cohort flounder whenever they're asked the question. I think people think, well, these are just this is a sideshow to govern, this is just culture war nonsense that no one cares about. Actually, women do care that you can't define them. That's 50% of the electorate.
Yeah, no, I find it hard to know at this point what... I think some things in the culture war are just... people don't take much notice of them. I think this issue people do take more notice of because it's so fundamental, isn't it? And especially when it comes into areas that are supposed to be science-based. So when it comes into the healthcare sector, when you have people talking about men getting pregnant and things in hospitals, I think, look, I'm all for empathy when it comes to trans people. I think their rights should be respected. I think we should have compassion. But at the same time, I don't think when you're in a setting, say sports setting or in a hospital, you have to also acknowledge biological reality. And I don't think that is incompatible with compassion and empathy.
I wouldn't have thought so, exactly. I mean, people don't like being lied to, I think. And I think when that BBC article, I don't know if you saw it a few weeks ago, talking about a serial killer, an elderly serial killer who had dismembered an elderly woman, killed other women, and only at the end of the article it casually mentions, who identifies as female. So it's a man. It's because this behaviour is not the behaviour of an elderly woman. We all know that. And you read it and you think, well, why are you lying to us? Why is the mainstream media, the state broadcaster, openly lying? That sort of stuff does really stir resentment, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it creates further distrust in institutions, which I think that is dangerous over the long term. I think this is one of the reasons why I think Russian propaganda has been successful in some quarters, and whether it's over COVID vaccines or whether it's over what's going on in Ukraine or this kind of disinformation, it creates this, because you don't trust the institutions of your own society, it creates this idea where you don't know what's true anymore.
But you're talking about Russian disinformation as in what sort of Twitter farms and people and the Russian government infiltrating that way? Is that what you mean?
And so, I mean, you have left-wing academics, it's not just left-wing academics, but they're the ones who've been paying attention to. So you have people in some of the universities who are promoting this idea that by just completely muddying the waters about what's true and what's not, they're just asking questions. And some of those people are regularly on Russian state media. And I think part of the reason that finds an audience in this country is, it's a declining trust in institutions, whether that's from the Iraq War because people feel they were lied to about that, whether it's because of the financial crash and people no longer believe that the narrative, there's no more boom and bust. I think there's generally been, and also media being dominated by upper middle class people who working class people can't relate to. So it's, you have this. So the media today, I think, in my profession as a journalist, is often dominated by liberal groupthink. You have people from a very narrow socioeconomic background who all kind of have the same kind of beliefs, and if you step outside of that, you're kind of treated as sort of a black sheep. And I think most people don't come from that background. Most people don't hold a lot of those beliefs, certainly when it comes to things like law and order, say. And I think that makes people feel alienated from the society they're in. They hear this coming from institutions and it doesn't resonate with them.
So how do we resolve that legitimation crisis where, as you say, mainstream media broadcasting is ideologically driven? It will tell you the story through that lens. Even things like the BBC reporting on that largely peaceful protest where even in the headline it admitted that 23 police officers were badly injured. That sort of thing. And that sort of seems to be not just in the media, but academia, civil service. It's sort of embedded into various institutions. What's the way out of that? Because I think you're right. I think the mistrust of authority figures generally leads people down some very odd rabbit holes, conspiratorial rabbit holes. There are people I know who I've spoken to who have started to believe all sorts of weird, bizarre conspiracy theories just because they assume everything they're being told is a lie. So how do we resolve that?
I think it's very dangerous when you lose all your bearings. So you can be cynical. I'm cynical sometimes, and I feel cynical about certain things or people or institutions. But when you completely lose all your bearings, I think this is one of the things that the Russians have recognized. That the thing is not to, I mean, in the Soviet Union, they used to try and create this completely alternative reality. That,
as all tyrannies do.
Yeah, but I think nowadays you see a country like Russia, it's just about creating mass confusion. So you completely lose your bearings and you do not know what's true or false, because that makes it easy for this authority type figure, a Putin type figure, to come in, and people look for someone to blame and someone to follow in those situations.
But are you saying, because I mean that argument though has been used to suggest that, for instance, the Brexit vote is illegitimate because Russia disseminated so much misinformation during the course of that?
No, I mean, I think they tried to have an influence on that, but I think there are much bigger, deeper issues that affected that than Russia. But I think it's more about sowing disinformation now, for example, and even over the COVID stuff, over our COVID vaccines, for example, they were spreading disinformation. And a family friend of mine from Shrewsbury, he actually was a conspiracy theorist and got drawn into this during COVID, and then actually died about it from COVID.
Right.
And Nick Cohen wrote about it last year, and it was someone who'd started off kind of questioning the establishment, which I think is good. I think we should all do that, but then had no bearings, had no idea what was a good source of information or a negative source or a destructive source of information. And on the internet, I think that it gets very easy to then get sucked into a dangerous rabbit hole.
I mean, that's a real worry, isn't it? The way that people do spiral out of control, and they're
not a bad person. It's just someone who was disillusioned, disenchanted with mainstream politics, like lots of people are. And then the first kind of sources they encountered, or the first people they encountered in Shrewsbury, because there is a big conspiratorial community there, led them down a very dangerous path, which ultimately, I think, contributed to their death, because they refused to take any precautions with COVID, and then they died alone in their flat in 2020.
Because I find these days when I read an article, I always have to check it in another paper. I mean, I do. I because there's always a disparity. There's always someone, a sort of authorial voice there trying to skew it or tell me what to think about it. And I don't know how to get beyond that. You know, we're not in that world anymore where the news are just telling you what the news is and leaving you free to decide what you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, Robert Conquest, the anti-Soviet historian, great author. He once said, I think that he had his kind of 5 laws or whatever, and he was like, one of them was that you're conservative about the thing you know most about.
Right. Okay.
I don't know if that's quite true, but what I've noticed with lots of media is when you read about a subject you know very well, say it's a topic you're very familiar with, you're an expert in, you just know when you read it in a newspaper that it's going to be very, very wrong in some way.
Yeah.
Because I think that partly goes back to how journalism's just squeezed in terms of money as well. So you just have generalists just churning something out in half an hour. And so you read that and it's just, and then you think, well, if that's wrong, what does that mean everything else is wrong as well? I definitely have seen that in some people I know.
Oh yeah, I mean that's an interesting thing. I had that experience many years ago where I read Michael Moore's book. What's it called? Straight White Men, something to do with white men. Stupid White Men. So I read that. I was very young when I read it, and I know a lot about Northern Irish politics, and I read his chapter on that, and it was so wrong. It was so fundamentally wrong, and I'd sort of gone along with everything else he'd said, and I got to that chapter, and I thought, well, if he's that wrong on that, what else is he getting wrong here? You know, that just seems to be. But by the same token, I've also noticed things that I know, there are plenty of gaps in my knowledge, believe me, but there are areas I do know a lot about, and then I see major institutions who are similarly meant to know a lot about this lying about it or getting it wrong. Mm-hmm. You know, if you think about the gender and sexuality issue, there are articles in the Scientific American getting it 100% wrong. Mm-hmm. So it's not just hacks throwing something out in half an hour. It's the people at the very top. It's the people in authority lying. Yeah,
I mean, a big part of this stuff, I think, is driven by ideology. It's not just constrained. Like you don't have to write nonsense. I mean, I sometimes are on a very tight deadline and have to turn something out quite quick. I still try and have some loyalty to the truth, though.
Right. But why has that been lost? Because for me, that's a prerequisite for journalism.
I think it's polarization has contributed to that. I mean, I think polarization. If you look at the main medium that journalists use to communicate now, is Twitter. Yeah. And Twitter is more polarized a space than any space I've encountered in real life, in the flesh and blood.
Yeah.
And people when I don't go on Twitter for a while, then I go on there. I'm kind of astonished by the way people take sides and just will not give an inch to the people they see as the other side. And I think the trans debate would be a good example of that, where I think both the trans activists and gender critical activists, I think they both make decent points in different ways. They both make bad points also in different ways. But I think the vitriolic nature of it, I mean, there has to be a compromise on this kind of stuff. There has to be some compromise on this stuff. But it feels like both factions just completely dig in. And because they're in these two echo chambers, I think, they also end up subscribing to even more kind of extreme beliefs. I think that's a good example of that, but it's not the only example. I think that occurs across lots of different ideas.
But why is it, and this is something I would really like if you could answer, because I don't know the answer, why is it that seems to be more prevalent on the left or on left-wing voices? I mean, if you take the trans debate that you've just, although of course gender critical feminists are overwhelmingly left-leaning, right? They've been branded as right-wing, so let's just put them in that bracket for now, right? Even though they're not. We see a lot of rape threats, death threats, harassment from the trans activist side. You never see that from the gender critical side, right? That doesn't happen. Now, why is there such an overwhelming ferocity on that side of this debate?
Well, I do think you see nasty stuff from
nasty stuff, sure.
So I mean,
we don't see reams of death threats and rape threats and that kind of thing.
No, but I think that's typically because the gender critical side is mostly women, and it tends to be men who threaten rape and threaten violence. I mean, that's if we look at the statistics on online abuse or real life abuse, it's men who overwhelmingly carry out these things, and the gender critical movement is mostly women. So I would say that's why.
Okay,
I mean, you do see some nasty stuff, which I don't think helps at all. So
sure.
Again, it polarizes it. So I think the gender critical feminists have a really strong argument that you should not be able to go in women's spaces just because you identify as a woman. I think you should not be able to play in a women's sports category as a biological male. I think to me, that is obvious. But then I don't think it helps the cause when you have shrill, loud voices on the gender critical side. I'm not saying leading proponents of those arguments or columnists or people like that. I'm not saying those people, but you do have these loud voices who don't believe trans people exist, think that gender dysphoria is not real, and we'll just dismiss these people as men in frocks and stuff. And I just think that's very offensive, but I also just think it's very unhelpful.
Oh yeah, I mean,
you're not winning advocates for your
exactly.
Your cause by saying that.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I've been piled on by those gender critical feminists as well. I've had to block quite a few, but they're the extreme. I'm talking about the sort of, if we take the, what happened the other day where J.K. Rowling has lunch with a number of female commentators, really decent bunch of people enjoying lunch, having wine and pasta, and then all these left-wing voices, or people who claim they're left-wing, saying, look at this coven of hate-filled, evil bigots and all that. And you stop and think for a second and think, but you must know that's not true. You must know these are decent people who happen to have a different worldview than you. What I want to know is why is that capacity to lie, or at least the willingness to just misrepresent the truth, so predominant? I'm not saying it doesn't happen on the right, but so predominant on the left.
I mean, I do think it happens on the right with Viktor Orban, for example. I think there have been people who've supported him, and he's done some very bad things. I think is responsible. He's not free speech. He's not against anti-Semitism, promoting conspiracy theories. I think on the left online, you have this kind of siege, like barracks mentality, where people will justify behaving appallingly because they tell themselves that they have no real power.
Yeah.
They tell themselves that their enemies are all powerful. So that means, therefore, that anything goes in terms of winning. So,
but why can't people?
This was something that the communists used to justify things in the past. That certain groups have power in society, and so anything we do is justified.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose. Look, you cite examples of course, there are right-wing people who will lie, have that tribalistic behaviour. Donald Trump was happy to misrepresent reality continually. That's a given. But why is it that the figureheads from the left, or at least the left, the sort of woke left, whatever you want to call them, who are mainstream entertainment figures, mainstream popular figures, are willing to openly lie? And even people like Philip Pullman, people who they'll say on Twitter, I've decided that these people are motivated by hate and bigotry, as though they're some kind of telepath. Now, an adult would sit there and say, hang on a minute, let me think about what they're trying to say, let me engage with that discussion, let me work out whether there's any merit to what they're saying. A child says, you're an evil, nasty person, you're Satan. Mm-hmm. And yet that childlike mentality is coming from people like Philip Pullman and coming from people like, comedians and artists. And that's why I think it's slightly more troubling, because it's so mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, I think the left has become more inquisitorial. So it does feel at times like a religious movement where if you fall outside the community of the good, so to speak, you're kind of exiled and you're persona non grata. And so I'm in that position on the left myself. So lots of people just will not have anything to do with me because I have the wrong opinion about something. So it's quite bizarre in some ways. I think this has got worse.
Have you lost friends over views?
I'm not sure if I suppose I have a few, but I tend not to make friends with people over politics anyway. So my actual friendship groups, they tend to have lots of different kinds of politics. So I mean, I'm not really spending time, like lots of working class people, I think we don't just hang around with people who are from our profession or whatever. Like I have my friends back home, some of them aren't interested in politics at all.
But why would people, I mean, I don't know the answer, but why would people be so willing to say things they know not to be true that are verifiably untrue? I mean, surely that's a kind of intellectual self-destruction, isn't it?
Then that's when I say it becomes almost like a pseudo-religion. It's you have these doctrinal beliefs and you will adhere to them regardless of the evidence. Then it's basically the same way certain people's religion works. They will shut down, like a flat earther like a flat earther or something. They will shut off any kind of alternative evidence. And it's a lot of it's to do with identity. And I think online, again, has amplified this. So you have people who, their identity is so bound up with their own politics, with their sense that they're a good, like, righteous person. And so if you disagree with them about something, you're not just disagreeing with them, you're not just disagreeing with this idea that's separate from them. You're fundamentally attacking them, their identity as a person and how they see themselves. I think that's become more of an issue with online, because online people have turned themselves into brands. People, especially in the Twitter space, commentators become brands, and then you have audience capture, so they're afraid to go against what their audience thinks. I mean, Owen Jones, we've seen this, we saw this with Corbyn. Yeah. I mean, I had a conversation with Owen in 2017, and he was saying, we both agree that Corbyn has to go. And then there was that election, then he completely did a 180 turn and was then the most dogmatic Corbynista on Twitter because he didn't want his audience to.
Maybe he changed his mind
against it. Yeah, but it was too much. It was like I agree people can change their minds, but when people go from one extreme to the other, I feel like there's overcompensation. Play.
That's interesting. I like what you say about this branding idea. I mean, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, because I always feel like, isn't it great to be proven wrong? If you're proven wrong, it means you won't carry on repeating a falsehood and making a fool of yourself. I had it quite recently where I wrote an article. I made a statement about a group which was factually wrong. They contacted me. I was like, okay, I'll correct that and I'll never do that again. That's great. Because I could have, if they hadn't done that, I might have repeated it more and more. Why is that not a positive thing? Why is that not something we can all say, thank you for?
No, I think it is a good
producing the
thing.
evidence.
I think it is a good thing. I think it's a very healthy thing for the individual. So I'm someone who is instinctively quite dogmatic, I would say.
Right.
So when I was younger, I was on the far left when I was younger, and I was quite dogmatic about things. And when someone disagreed with me, I'd feel kind of these kind of pangs of insecurity, like it was
like a personal attack.
Yeah, it would feel like that. And I've tried. It's a work in progress. It's always a work in progress. But I mean, I'm not like that so much anymore. I feel like I'm much more tolerant of people who think differently, and it's like, look, we can think differently, it's fine. I'm fine with ambiguity. I think I've come a long way since then because I've consciously tried to do that, because I think it's bad for you as a person just to be angry all the time. I don't use Twitter so much anymore because I have to as a journalist, but I feel like you just have these people who wake up in the morning and search for things to be outraged about. I don't want to be that kind of person around my friends and family. And I just think that you don't actually you make it harder to find solutions, which involves getting input from lots of different sources. And I may still think that this one thing is right and this other person is wrong, but that doesn't mean they're completely wrong, and it doesn't mean that there aren't flaws in my argument, which I'll learn from talking with them.
I mean, it's sad in a way, isn't it? Because if you do, I mean, I've lost friends who are now convinced that we live in a neo-fascist state, and they see fascists in every shadow, and they interpret any mild political difference as evidence of neo-Nazism, and that must be a horrible. That must be like being in a cult where you see demons everywhere. I think that's really sad.
Yeah, I mean, it's damaging, I think, for your own work as well. So I'm just starting to write a new book, and one of the things I notice is that if I meet people who just disagree with me about this thing and just chat about it with them, even I may still go away and I still think what I thought before, but there will be holes in my argument that I hadn't noticed before they had spoken to me about it, and then my work becomes much stronger for that. So I think it's absolutely essential, just from a self-interested position, to seek out people who disagree with you.
So what's the new book about?
So the new book will be about, I'm writing it now, it's about the manosphere and kind of...
The manosphere?
The manosphere, so online subcultures of men, various online subcultures of men, so from incels to men going their own way to... It's not really pick-up artists anymore, but these kind of subcultures that have arisen in recent years on the back of the internet, and also as a kind of reaction to dating apps as well, I've noticed. Like incel culture is dating apps, and the rise of those has had a big influence on the growth of incel culture.
Have you spoken to people who self-identify as incel?
Yes, many.
I mean, that's very interesting. How do they strike you? I know that's a broad question, but they're so mythologized in the media that it's difficult to almost difficult to see them as human beings in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is one issue that I've researched a lot and spoken with lots of these people. And this is another thing that frustrates me about the media, because the only time incels are really covered in the media, it's when there's some terrorist attack. It's, is this incel related or not? Or just as this kind of hateful neo-Nazi movement that should be banned, or
we should clarify
with far-right links.
Because I think people may not know, incel means involuntary celibate.
Yes.
Groups of men who have decided to swear off women.
Well, swear off women is men going their own way. So they've decided to they're like male separatists. Okay. It's like you had female separatists in the feminist movement in the 60s, 70s. Men going their own way as male separatists. Incels are people who've resigned themselves to a life of without intimacy. I was going to say sexlessness, but it's intimacy really, because lots of people say to them, why don't you just get an escort or pay for an escort or something if it's just sex? But they will often say, well, no, it's about intimacy and experiencing romantic love.
And it's mostly younger people, right? Yeah,
I mean, it's overwhelmingly young men. And again, there are some of these forums which, it's quite misogynist worldview attached to the incel movements. But for the most part, it's mostly very depressed young men, late teens, early 20s typically, sometimes older, and often they have problems such as autism, so they find it hard to socialize, facial disfigurements, disabilities. Right. It's not like the vitriolic coverage the incel movement receives is this great threat to society. Well, I mean, most incels are non-violent. Most incels just confine themselves to trolling on internet forums and. So big question, and I'm sure your book answers it and develops it, but where does this come from? Where is it? How has this happened? I mean, it's complex, obviously. So the fact that there are more sexless men nowadays, not all of them identify as incels, obviously. But there's been a huge rise in the proportion of young men who are not having sex in America, in Britain, in places like South Korea as well, in like all over the world. And one of the reasons is in the West, for example, is the decline of traditional institutions like marriage. So women's socioeconomic liberation, if you like. So women, like many of these things are good as well. So women no longer have to marry just to keep a roof over their head. They can work themselves. So these are not necessarily negative things. But this has meant that women can be much more discerning about who they partner up with, who they hook up with. Yeah. Which leaves more men on the shelf. Back in the olden days, people would tend to pair off with people in their village. There'd be lots of pressure on women that they needed to get married. They needed to find a suitable partner to marry. Nowadays, you can go on a dating app and you can date someone who lives in a big city. You don't have to confine yourself to that pool of people. And dating apps, the rise of dating apps. I think most young people will now use dating apps to find a relationship. They are ruthless in terms of the algorithm is ruthless. You get weeded if you're not photogenic, if you don't have the correct like vital statistics in terms of your height or whatever it is. You're not even going to get in front of the person. Whereas even in the days of bars and clubs and stuff, you would at least be able to make an impression of someone with your personality, if you're charismatic or well-dressed or whatever, the life of the party. Dating apps kind of funnel these our selection criteria through even more narrow.
Yeah, they're brutal, aren't they?
So I mean, you don't even get in front of someone if you don't tick this.
And decisions are made in a second.
Yeah.
In terms of swiping left or right.
Yeah, so I think that's made a huge difference, and also because the sheer volume of rejection people can experience on dating apps, it's unprecedented, really. So I mean, when I was kind of between the ages of like 16 and 22, I think, I didn't have a girlfriend. I had one girlfriend when I was 16, then I didn't have another girlfriend for like 5 years, I think. I was living in the countryside with my grandmother. I was quite reclusive at that time, didn't go out a lot. It was like my own fault, really. But I could always kid myself with this story that, if I wanted to, I could get a girlfriend. I could protect my ego by telling myself, if I wanted to, it'd be fine. What dating apps do is the bar is very low in terms of putting yourself out there. You just create a profile, and there you go. But the volume of rejection is higher than anything I ever experienced in that situation. So you could be getting rejected hundreds of times in an afternoon.
I haven't seen how the apps work. Do you see the level of rejection, or are you not told?
Well, I mean, you're going to be getting no matches if your profile is subpar, and I think we can say, look, I don't think it's as harsh as being told to F off by a woman in real life. But it gives you some idea of your place in kind of the sexual hierarchy, so to speak. Yeah. So people aren't stupid you're not getting any matches, and then you hear these, you look at Instagram and you see these men like Dan Bilzerian who are surrounded by women in bikinis or whatever. It kind of creates this sense that you're never going. It's hopeless for you. It's a waste of time because they transpose that onto real life and think that because Gen Z, many millennials have just been brought up where these things, where online is everything, I think they transpose that onto the real world and think, what goes on apps is reality. Whereas I've noticed that a lot with younger people.
But some people interpret that movement, the incel movement, as being a reaction against feminism.
I think it partly is.
But also a reaction against female equality. We don't like it anymore because we're not in control. Is that a fair point?
I definitely think that's part of it. But my point is, though, that's not the only element of it.
Right, I see.
Because that's been, there's been a reaction against female equality for a long time, since before the 90s, forever really. But there was books being written in the 90s talking about the male backlash against feminism. Yeah. But what's amplified it is technology. I think is the kind of the way in which romance has been kind of outsourced to algorithms. I think that's made a massive difference. And from immersing myself in this world for the past 2 years, really. The conversations I have with people younger than me, they often have a very, to my mind, distorted view of how romance and dating works. So it's much more superficial, I think. And to me, that's obviously stems from what goes on apps. So you have far more men getting plastic surgery now, and extreme plastic surgery in some instances. Whereas in the past, I don't think that would have been such an issue because again, I have friends who I go out with on the weekends, and they're not cover models. They're not the most. They don't have the chiseled jaw.
They might be watching. So
yeah, they don't all have the chiseled jaw, or some of them are kind of 5'7" or something, and they still do well because when they kind of communicate their personality or whatever, it's not just about these superficial.
No, confidence is, I think, the biggest thing, isn't it?
There's all sorts of things. And Mia Levitin wrote a book about. She went on, I think, over 100 Tinder dates and wrote this book about it.
Yeah.
And she said something very interesting. She said, if she put all the people she'd ever dated in real life and met in real life on a dating app, she'd probably reject most of them. Right. Because the thing she liked about them was something that couldn't be kind of just slotted into one characteristic. It was the vibe, it was their personality, it was the chemistry.
Yeah, I'm told even scent is a big deal, and pheromones.
Yeah, I think this idea that everything can be kind of put through this narrow kind of algorithm, and we can turn dating into shopping. So it's fundamentally wrong.
Is that connecting more broadly then to the commodification of ourselves through social media, the way we package ourselves up, decide which photos people see, filter things out? We become a product.
Yeah, we become a product, and we outsource things, we outsource, we allow the algorithms to formalize to decide what our preferences are.
Yeah.
So things we may have not seen as important before are now considered the be all and end all. So height is a perfect example. So I've had this conversation with female friends about, you know, dating apps, because I'm researching it. I want to know what their experience of dating apps is, and they will tell me that they have filters on dating apps which say, you know, must be 6 foot. Yeah. And then I will say, but so have you ever dated anyone who's not 6 foot? And they always say yes. Right. I mean, I'm like 5'11". I'm not 6 foot, and these are some of these people I've dated myself. And it's like, well, you would have. Well,
were you wearing platforms or something? It feels weird to have like a height chart.
It's a very common thing, and it's just men do this as well in different ways. But I think it's a good example of how what we think we want sometimes isn't what we actually are attracted to. It's almost like that's been imposed on us in some way by societal standards and Instagram and whatever it is.
Do you think these men that you've been talking to in that sort of subculture has been impacted by discourses such as toxic masculinity and the way in which that has fed into popular culture, advertising, the Gillette advert, which struck me as just berating men for being men. Do you think that's had an impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the stuff, let's, for example, the Me Too movement.
Right.
I think that was necessary. I think powerful men had got away with some pretty egregious things for far too long. But I think some people see that movement, some young men, and then they think that, you know, even approaching a woman, even in the appropriate context. Say you're out at a bar and you approach someone, and you know you behave properly, like if they're not interested, you respectfully leave. Yeah. They think that would be potentially harassment. I mean, that is something I've encountered with younger men.
Yes.
Younger friends of mine who I've seen out, they wouldn't dream of doing that, and it just I think that's been quite toxic. It's just made it harder to meet people. And I don't think that's particularly good for women either, because I think women want to meet decent men, and the thing is, the bad guys will not be put off by that discourse. They will still do it anyway. They will still behave badly anyway. But some of that discourse, it puts off the decent people who are afraid of doing the wrong thing, who are terrified of being, having their face on Twitter or Reddit because they've said the wrong thing on a dating app or whatever.
Well, it's also, when it comes to sexual matters, it's also very easy to be gauche and very easy to say the wrong thing, you know.
Anyway,
I mean, and I've said,
you have to allow for that a bit, I think.
Yeah, I mean, but I get why, exactly what you say. There were clearly men in power getting away with all sorts of things, but also anyone who's living a life where they're sexually assaulting other people, that needs to be stopped. Yeah. So all of that was sort of necessary. But then, I mean, there are a number of writers such as Ella Whelan, Joanna Williams have talked about the way in which bad dates, bad experiences with men has been folded into these sort of more egregious examples of sexual assault and rape and that kind of thing, to the extent that some young people now find it difficult. They think that someone making a bit of a clumsy, stumbling approach is the same as a Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, so I mean, so a bad date has been folded into the category of abuse, right, or ghosting someone, like not replying to their texts is now abuse or gaslighting or something.
I think it's rude.
Yeah, no, of course. But there is a difference, I think, between I think there's an attempt to make everything unpleasant illegal, or you know, someone has to be completely ostracized because they were unpleasant once. I mean, we have I saw last week on the Tube there are these posters which say unwanted staring is harassment.
I saw that.
And unwanted staring of a sexual nature is harassment, and it's essentially that you could be arrested for it. I mean, they will never get a prosecution for that because it's subjective. What constitutes staring of a sexual nature is very. I mean, it's a bad. If someone's doing that, it's very creepy, and I don't think people should do that. Yeah. Make someone uncomfortable like that at all. But you can't. That's a cultural thing. That requires cultural change. That requires people to behave more respectfully towards others. You cannot legislate to stop that happening. I fail to see how. But this idea that you can, I think, is dangerous, because it gives this kind of false reassurance that you don't have to take any responsibility yourself. You don't have to get away from people who are doing things like that. That you can just rely on the state to solve your problem. And I think, you know, where the state can solve the problems, it should try to do that. But I think this kind of false reassurance, I think, it can be dangerous.
I mean, there's no way you can police staring, or nor should you really, insofar as people have a right to look at what they want. And if people are being creepy, then surely someone can move away. And
you can't. It's subjective. I mean, is it creepier if the person doing it is unattractive? If I feel uncomfortable because someone is looking at me and I find them very unattractive, does that mean it's now a criminal offence? Whereas if it's someone I find attractive, even say I'm with my girlfriend, I might find that uncomfortable. Does that mean it's okay then? It's completely subjective. And I don't think it's. I don't think we should go down the road of trying to actually police those things. I think I have no problem with the sign telling men that you shouldn't do that. It makes people feel very uncomfortable, that it's not cool and it's creepy and weird.
But the idea that
somehow the law can intervene, I think.
Why is that sign necessary? We all know that. And the people who don't know it are the creeps who they know it as well. They just don't care.
I don't think everyone does know it. All men do know it. But I do agree with you in the sense that I don't think a sign's going to make much difference.
No.
I think it's a broader kind of cultural thing. I think men should, I think generally in this space, I think in the space of kind of sexual relations, we should try to empathize with each other more. Like, men and women have very different concerns. Men, I think, one of the best things men can do is try to understand women's concerns around safety, for example, especially around dating. So, I've never been on a date and worried about that I'm going to be stuffed in the boot of a car or something by the end of the night. That's never crossed my mind. And I think most men wouldn't realise that things like this do cross women's minds when they go and meet a stranger.
Now, that's a very interesting point. When you talk to women about walking home at night, they hold their keys and things like this, stuff that just doesn't occur to men. But all of that kind of stuff surely could be brought into schooling. And that's the level where you should teach boys about those realities that they wouldn't otherwise. I think once you get into the adult world, signs telling you how to behave or trying to police forms of sexual behaviour.
No, I agree. And there are some, I just written an article for Prospect magazine actually, and there are some male figures, authority figures who do run training programs which are about creating kind of a healthy masculinity, which is, and there's something called the bystander approach, which a guy called Graham Goulden, who's a former police sergeant in Scotland, and it's about intervening when you see friends of yours doing something wrong around women. So say approaching a woman and just not backing off if they're not interested. It teaches you as a mate to say this isn't cool.
But again,
that is very good.
Isn't that for young people, right? Really? I mean,
anyone really. So I mean, I think it's valid kind of if your friend is make some really misogynist like remark. I think it's important to say that's not cool. I don't think that's cool to talk like that. I mean, I would do it if my friends were making racist remarks or whatever.
Well, so would I.
I would say that I would say that's I don't want to hear that. I don't think that's cool.
So would I. I just think that sort of thing should be. That's about socialization. I think once we're in adulthood, we're in a different realm. But what about the idea that all of these problems are systemic? That there's something about, because I mean, I spoke to Christina Hoff Sommers on this show, and her thesis was that boys at school are now masculinity itself is so mistrusted that boys are being socialized to be girls. Because the idea that there is such a thing as femininity and masculinity, that's so mistrusted that actually, but the end result of this is that rough play among boys is punished. In other words, we don't want boys to be boys. Do you think she's got a point?
I think that is happening in some quarters, and I think it's a problem. So I mean, I think one of the issues I had as a teenager was I was very into kind of punk and emo music. That was kind of, and I rebelled against traditional masculinity because my stepfather was kind of a dick and I didn't really like him, and he was always like, you must play rugby, you're kind of a wimp you're a wuss if you don't do this. And so I spent a long period of time rebelling against that. Like I dyed my hair red, green, and kind of wore like piercings and stuff. I wouldn't say I was feminine or even androgynous. I was just not particularly masculine, and I did that, created that kind of style on purpose. And weirdly enough, I did very poorly with the opposite sex. So I had to actually cultivate more masculinities to some extent. Anyway, I started to go to the gym. I had to behave in a bit more of an assertive manner. Things that are traditionally considered more masculine traits, because then I found actually it made it easier to actually get a girlfriend. I think that's a real factor, because I don't think I think you're doing men a disservice if you say that there's no gender is linked to sexuality to some extent. I think, yes, there are aspects of gender that are socially constructed. There are ridiculous things attached to gender that are socially constructed. But on some level, masculinity is what's historically been selected for by women. This is why we have This is why if you look at these studies that Professor David Buss has done, these huge cross-cultural studies, why do women value things like status, strength?
Yeah.
And so if you say things like, oh, men should not pursue status, men should not lift weights because it's adhering to this false idea of what masculinity is, well, you're actually probably doing a disservice to them, because it's probably going to damage their dating life, if nothing else. And yeah, I think that's something that is a factor.
Well, the studies are clear on that. A lot of women are attracted to traditionally masculine men.
You don't have to be a toxic male or whatever to, like, you can be masculine without being toxic. I think this idea that masculinity itself is toxic, I think that's just wrong. I mean, masculinity can be all sorts of things. Masculinity can be protecting someone. Masculinity can be strength used. Masculinity is like strength, and you have strength and you can use it in whichever way you choose. It doesn't mean that the strength itself is wrong or whatever, or yeah, I think or stoicism itself is somehow bad. And I do think men and women communicate differently. I think I think men should talk more about their emotions. My grandmother died in January and I've been grieving, and one of the things that I've learned is that bottling it up is not a good idea. It's going to come back in the long term if I do that. So I have to be emotive. But I think men and women address their problems differently. My girlfriend likes to talk about stuff for the sake of talking about it and feels better for that, whereas I want a solution to the problem. And I think there are these slight subtle differences, and pretending that the only reason men don't want to spend endless hours in therapy is because they just are scared of their feelings. No, I don't think that's right. I think we have a different way of dealing with problems.
Do you fear,
on average?
I mean, you're writing about this sort of stuff, you're talking about this sort of stuff. Do you fear that people will accuse you of therefore being contributing to a misogynistic culture?
I know that's going to happen. I don't really care anymore, because it's like, I mean, sometimes I think about it, but you just can't say anything worth saying unless you adhere to what you think is true. And now I'm kind of speculating a bit, and everything I've said today I will go through in my book and challenge myself. Am I actually right about that? What are these other people saying?
Yeah.
But I feel like I've immersed myself in some of these subcultures more than pretty much anyone else I know. And so I do think I have a valid point to make, and you don't have to agree with me, but it's coming from a place of integrity, I think. I'm not just saying it because I have an agenda, or it's like I think this because this is, like, I'm prepared to be wrong, but this is what I think because this is the evidence I've seen.
Yeah, amen to that. Fantastic. James, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, it's been really fun.
Thanks. This has been the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle, and my guest, James Bloodworth. If you enjoyed the show, please do like and subscribe, tell your friends, and also check out James's books, The Myth of Meritocracy and Hired. You can also find James on Twitter at @J_Bloodworth and on Instagram, James.Bloodworth. I'll see you next week.